Hi, this is the Bible Forum, and I am Warren Sprouse. We're here every Sunday night from 8 until 10 p.m., sometimes longer, and we're here for you. I know you are paying attention, and you know that the Second Amendment of our Constitution is once again under pressure. Vice Chairman for Civic Engagement and Voter Protection for the Democrat National Committee, a person by the name of Karen Carter Peterson, has issued a tweet this week. She says, quote, "Repeal the Second Amendment," end of quote. And she has linked former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stevens' op-ed. You saw that this week, right? She said, "This weekend's marches make it clear. To enact real gun control, we need to change the Constitution. Note to American citizens, Second Amendment exists to protect citizens from their government." We weren't around in 1791, but in our Constitution, the text of the Second Amendment reads, quote, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," end quote. The framers of the Bill of Rights adapted the wording of the amendment from nearly identical clauses in some of the original 13 state constitutions. Historically, the context is Revolutionary War. During the Revolutionary War era, militia referred to groups of men who banded together to protect their communities, their towns, their colonies, and eventually states, once the United States declared its independence from Great Britain in 1776. Many people in America at the time believed governments used soldiers to oppress the people. Where did they get such an idea? From governments that oppress the people. And they thought the federal government should only be allowed to raise armies with full-time paid soldiers when facing foreign adversaries. But for all other purposes, they believed it should turn to a part-time militia or ordinary civilians using their own weapons. But as militias had proved inefficient against the British, the Constitutional Convention gave the new federal government the power to establish a standing army, even in peacetime. Now, opponents of a strong central government, known as anti-federalists, argued that this federal army deprived states of their ability to defend themselves against oppression. They feared that Congress might abuse its constitutional power of, quote, "organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia," end of quote, by failing to keep militiamen equipped with adequate arms. So, American citizens were given the right to own and bear guns. Now, clearly not every American did so, since children, drunks, criminals, insane, and others are not equipped for this kind of power. There are caveats, there are controls here. Well, today, sadly, and throughout the history of the United States, the same kinds of things still exist. Governments, generally not authoritarian, as well as so-called democratic governments, including elements within the government, meaning those who are liberal meaning without common sense or ulterior motive, are not limited to or by established traditional orthodox or authoritarian attitudes, views, or dogmas, very often espouse liberal ideals. Now keep in mind, when our Constitution speaks, it speaks from a biblical perspective. The enemies of justice and reason are also enemies of freedom. The Liberal Party in America wants to convince you that ours is a purely secular society, not owing any allegiance to biblical warrant. They haven't been able to actually accomplish this, but they are gaining ground, largely due to America's rush to shed themselves of God, meaning objective moral standards. We don't have a Bible in every home anymore. We don't read the Bible anymore. God is not real in our system anymore. Therefore, the objective standards of right and wrong are gone. Everything is now relative. I don't believe you ought to be stealing food, but if you're hungry, I understand. It's hard, and it gets worse. Our current president and a majority of our conservative office holders actually believe they are Christians, whether or not they meet the biblical definition or the biblical standards, and many of them do not. What they say is they know that whatsoever is not biblical is inherently wrong. It's wrong-headed, organizationally, socially, legislatively. And it is also suspect among those who hold conservative ideals. Currently, our president is enjoying an approval rating of 50% in 1 year. The Rasmussen poll just in the last week or so, Rasmussen, the only group measuring this issue today, says it's 50%. Evangelicals are happy to have him. Rascal that he is. In large part because he makes practical decisions and believes strongly in absolute business standards. Now keep in mind there are no liberal business standards, at least none that have ever worked. The most liberal businessmen and women in the world, the ones who make the money, do it by following absolute principles of business. They don't do what they feel like. They don't do what the liberal, progressive, whatever says is the best thing to do. They do what works. They are literalists when it comes to business. Those who are liberal in terms of politics, religion, and so forth are hypocrites, or perhaps opportunists. We're being told that guns are the problem. Guns are amoral. A gun doesn't care how you use it. The gun has no moral, political, or social values. Last week we learned of 2 homosexual women who adopted 7 children, and all 9 of them were in the same vehicle. When the one driving suddenly took off, sped up, went off the cliff onto the rocks below, killed all 11 people. 2 or 3 of them were missing. It was an ocean cliff, 75, 150 feet, whatever it was. I say outlaw Chevy Suburbans. How about you? Nobody thinks like that. But guns? Oh yeah. Guns are dangerous, and they must be eliminated from society. The real problem? Several generations of Americans have been educated by our liberal, socialist educational system. Psychiatrist John Dewey is the father of modern American education. He said aloud, he wrote how that he was creating a psychological lab out of every classroom. And it took him 2 generations, but it worked. By the mid-1960s, he had created an army of demonstrators against the government. Oh, we blame the Vietnam War. Oh, it wasn't a war, it was a conflict. North Vietnamese gunboats attacked our warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress enacted the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson all the power, all the authority he needed to resolve that situation. And for the first time in U.S. history, young people refused to be drafted. They took to the streets in often violent demonstrations against our government. The media was there. It sympathized. Television brought it into our living rooms every evening. And we had a situation. Now, there were a sizable number of Americans against war with Germany in 1939. And even after they declared war on us, it helped that Japan attacked our Hawaiian outpost. But in terms of an historical note, these protesters who took to the streets in the 1960s were using methods that were not good, not right. Their motives were clearly selfish. They didn't want to go. They didn't want to sacrifice their future, their college, their jobs, their families, maybe their life. Underneath, they had an individualistic value system and an elevated sense of self, all of which came from the psychosocial training they'd received in the so-called public school system. And since 1960, that has gotten worse. Children no longer see themselves under parental authority. But did I mention to you that the president really had no authority? That we didn't call it a war because he exceeded his authority constitutionally. Yeah, he did. Children don't see themselves under parental authority. They don't believe that anything their parents tell them that they don't want to believe. Children are no longer protected from the ravages of sin and degradation. At 5 years of age, they know cuss words and they know how to use them, even if they don't know what they mean. At 10 years of age, they're asserting their own will against their parents. At 15, they view themselves as full-fledged adults with all the rights and privileges that might bring. At 30 years of age, many of them are still children. No job, no family, no purpose. But they still got plenty of opinion. And now they have social media to express it. And into this milieu comes our assassins. Children with guns and the will to use them against their classmates. Young adults with guns, making a statement. Activists with guns, pushing their agenda. And disturbed, misguided, desperate people, usually men, with guns. So guns are the problem. Eliminate the guns, and we won't have these mass killings. Ever hear about bombs? Cars, trucks, machetes? And are these not in the news today? Nobody's standing up against cars. The fact is that people are basically destructive. It's why God created parents. Watch your baby, hardly able to crawl. They will find sheer joy in knocking down the blocks you just built up for them. They will not find joy in building the blocks. They'll just find joy in knocking them down. Young people will find more satisfaction in being destructive than constructive. Constructive is hard. Adults will give vent to their destructive passions far quicker than their constructive desire. Tearing down, destroying, corrupting, that's easy. And it comes from anger and pride and arrogance and selfishness. Are we passing laws against any of these? And what about homosexuality? In terms of sexual disease, the destruction of body parts, social confusion, not to mention the elimination of the species, are we passing laws against that? And what about the drinking of alcohol? Is there much in life that's more destructive? And can we talk about drugs, legal and otherwise? Our sympathies are with those who suffer the result of guns, but a gun has never killed anyone. It takes a careless, foolish, frustrated, hopeless, angry, and yes, stupid person to kill another human being. And much of that is traceable to the breakdown of our family. Something our social experts and leaders have encouraged, designed, and supported, all the while appearing to stand against it. America has a spiritual problem. I'm not just talking religiously spiritual, socially religious problem. We hate the family. We hate decent society. We hate the oughts and the shoulds. We hate Bible religion. We like all the other kind, but we don't like the Bible kind. And we hate anything that tells us we can't. And if you don't believe me, look around and tell me what else you would call it.